War must be, while we defend our lives against a destroyer who devours all. I do not love the bright sword. I love that only which it defends. Hello, class. Mark Snyder. And that was a quote by Mr. J.R.R. Tolkien. Today I'll be informing you about an allegory that can be formed between World War II and the War of the Rings. A little credibility. I wrote a paper about this in my freshman year, and I just finished up doing some research to give you the best and most current information I could find. So we're going to start with an overview of World War II so you know exactly what I'm talking about and you're not lost when I make these connections. And then we're going to move into the kingdoms of Middle-earth and who they represented in World War II. After that, we're going to talk about the Allied forces and their leaders and who represented them in Lord of the Rings. And then lastly, we'll talk about the Axis forces and their leaders and who Tolkien wrote to represent them. So the overview, Germany in 1939 invades Poland with a blitzkrieg action, which is a very quick attack, push right into the country, take over very viciously, aggressively. And then they were held there for a few months before moving on to take Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, and even 3/5 of France. And then they pushed out to the English Channel and began an aerial war known as the Battle of Britain with the British, where they tried to knock out the Royal Air Force, who would stop them from an amphibious or a boat attack onto this island country. And they were able to hold their line for about 2-3 years. Now, Germany and Italy were fighting with British forces in Africa as well. Now, if we move to the east, Japan has invaded parts of China, and China is starting a withdrawal and retreat tactic to allow them in, but hope to get, with all their landmass, to get a counterattack going on. And then in 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. This is where, in Hawaii, and also when the United States decides to openly join the war. They had a very isolationist mentality at the time. After World War I, the insane amount of losses that World War I caused for the United States created us to not want to join another war. But this attack on Pearl Harbor really pushed us into this war. So we then began a war on two fronts. In the Pacific, we fought the Japanese, and in Europe, we joined the Allies and fought against Germany and Italy. In 1944, June 6th, B-Day, that's where we really pushed off from Britain and began our push into Europe. We're going to fast forward to Germany, 1945. The fall of Berlin was caused by the Russians. And so then, there you have it. There's a brief history of World War II in a nutshell. So we're going to move right into the countries versus the kingdoms. So the British would be seen as Gondor, this bastion in the west, this big powerhouse. They've been there forever. They are the leaders of the free world, and that's really how a lot of British citizens saw themselves, fighting the good fight, defending the rest of the world from evil. That evil would be Germany, and Germany would be seen as the Mordor kingdom. They were the epitome of evil, and they hurt everything they touched. When they went in, they took people down. They were just cruel, and that's how we see Nazi Germany, and that's how they were represented in the book. Isengard, would be represented by Japan, or Japan would be represented by Isengard, excuse me. And they joined this war. They joined up with the Mordor, or Japan joined up with Germany at the time, and they pushed off, and they actually attacked Rohan, or the United States, and ended up having us join the war. And Rohan had this isolationist mentality just like the United States, and we eventually had to join the war and helped turn the tide for good. Leaders of the Allies, we'll start with Britain again. Winston Churchill, the prime minister, would probably be seen as a Faramir figure. He was kind of an outcast in his own time, but now people love him, just like Faramir. He was an outcast in his own time, he was kind of an outsider, but he helped win that war. And then there was a King George VI of England, who was actually the King of England, and he would be the Denethor figure, Faramir's father, kind of more in charge. In America, you had President FDR, who was seen as this Theoden figure, king of the horse lords, who actually ends up dying before the end of the war, just like President FDR did. Was taken over by Truman, just like Rohan was taken over by Aemir, the nephew of Theoden. And then you would have China. China would be seen as the elves almost. They were there. They were doing their thing. They were very earthy people. However, they weren't really seen too much in our history books, at least, and neither in their history books as well. Moving right along, we'll go into the Axis, and Hitler. We're going to see him as the big bad guy, and Sauron was the big bad guy. So they were definitely representing the terribleness of Hitler. Then you have Saruman, who would be represented as Hideko Tojo, who was the leader of the Japanese. And then the various other countries would be seen just as these random forces of evil. So in conclusion, besides being a classic piece of literature, Lord of the Rings is also a history lesson, telling us about the Second World War. Tolkien even preserved the leaders of World War One, or World War II, excuse me, and the countries that preserved World War II. He really nailed everything about it. To wrap things up, I leave you with this quote from George Santayana: "Those who cannot remember history are condemned to repeat it." Thank you so much.